B. Collins.
Peter B. Collins, news and comment. It's Thursday, June 7th, 2018. You hear a lot about fake news in the corporate media. But what about when the corporate media feeds us news that is spun, is based on unproven allegations, and consensus views where allegations pass as facts? Well, from time to time, I like to kind of review the work of the corporate media and try to challenge you to think critically about the news that you consume on a daily basis. And every night I DVR the PBS Newshour. It is, unfortunately, the best long-form news program that we have in this country. And I use it as a reference point every day to see basically what's going on inside the Beltway, because that is the frame and the worldview of public television's long-form news program. And it's populated by old people. They have some new hires there, but Judy Woodruff is an aging anchor who always plays it safe. She doesn't ask tough questions that invite skeptical analysis of some of the biggest stories of the day. And the mix of guests that they invite on the NewsHour rarely includes anyone that you and I would consider to be a respected progressive, or virtually anyone who is considered left of center. They'll often have two guests, one representing the far right and the other representing the right. And that is considered diversity at the public television news hour. So the report that, is sticking in my craw right now aired last night on June 6th on PBS. Their guest they chose is the author of a new book called Messing with the Enemy. And Nick Schifrin interviews Clint Watts, a former U.S. government intelligence analyst who is a darling of some of these congressional hearings about the Russiagate scandal. And I want you to listen critically to his answers to some of the questions that go unchallenged in terms of any follow-ups. And I will provide what I consider to be the right corrective commentary. Here we go.
Combustible mix.
Judy, thank you. Last year, the U.S. intelligence community concluded that in 2016, Russia launched a campaign of disinformation to discredit Hillary Clinton and help elect Donald Trump. One of the sharpest analysts of Russia's so-called active measures is former U.S. government intelligence analyst Clint Watts, who almost 1 year ago testified before the Senate Intelligence Committee.
Part of the reason active measures have worked in this U.S. election is because the commander-in-chief has used Russian active measures at time against his opponents. But until we get a firm basis on fact and fiction in our own country, get some agreement about the facts, whether it be do I support the intelligence community or a story I read on my Twitter feed, we're going to have a big problem.
So, the setup for this interview is unchallenged reference to the assertions of the intelligence community about Russian meddling in our election. And anybody who's a regular listener knows that I'm skeptical of these claims. Not so at PBS, where they set it up, basically telling viewers to believe what the government has told us despite the lack of known sources and publicly available evidence. Then they trot out Clint Watts, who basically gives us this black and white choice. You either believe the intelligence community or some bullshit you saw on Twitter. There is no middle ground. And the intelligence community is seen as the source of the Holy Grail. Again, unchallenged by PBS.
That problem continues today, and Watts has advised the Senate Intelligence Committee on its investigation into Russian meddling. He's also written a new book, Messing with the Enemy, Surviving in a Social Media World of Hackers, Terrorists, Russians, and Fake News. And Clint Watts joins me here in the studio.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks very much. I want to get today in a second, but let's go back to 2014. You're investigating terrorists. In fact, you're actually talking to some terrorists, and that's when you first encounter Russian trolls. Tell us about that.
Yeah, Russian trolls were different from normal trolls. I think everybody gets trolls if you're on social media, but they tend to not stick around forever. They are motivated usually whenever you're talking, but this was continuous. And when you looked at the accounts, they were sharing basically the same message. They would share the same content or links. And they also looked to be almost uniformly spread around the world, and they would talk all hours of the night. And so it was the first time I saw this sort of sustained and persistent campaign that it looked much larger, but when you really got to the core of it, was just a few small actors. And that's what I knew I was onto something very different from the terrorism sort of field that I've been looking at before.
And fast forward.
Now, he's not required to offer any evidence or details for this claim that he makes that he can identify Russian trolls. This is purely anecdotal, and it is seen as something that can be taken simply on face value.
Forward to 2016, Russia launched what you call the most sophisticated hacking campaign in world history. But they weren't hacking only our computers. They were hacking, you write, our minds. What do you mean?
They were hacking to gain compromising information on targets so they could dump that out into the open and then use that in social media to influence people towards a particular policy position. This is very different. It was a lot of different targets in the U.S. and in the EU. It was political parties, media personalities, anyone that was an opponent of Russia. And it was such a wide scale that it gave them really the ammunition, the nuclear fuel to power those narratives going into 2016.
You think that it was successful. And in fact, you specifically write that Russia helped give Trump Michigan and Wisconsin, and therefore the presidency. What's your proof of that?
Just from my analysis of watching it and looking at the votes. Essentially, those were the two closest contests in the United States. Those two states were states that Russia may very well have won because of several different factors. One, Bernie Sanders performed better than Hillary Clinton during the primaries in those two states, which was a surprise. The narrative that Bernie Sanders got a raw deal from the DNC came 100% from a Russian action. They stole the DNC's records, they leaked that out there, and they powered that narrative.
So, this is the overarching claim, the foundational claim of the Russiagate narrative. And he presents it without any evidence because we all know it's true. And the PBS interviewer here, Nick Schifrin, does not try to challenge these claims or ask him to prove them in any way. And when he claims that Michigan and Wisconsin, which Bernie Sanders won fair and square in the primaries, that was somehow fueled by Russia, again, this is propaganda, where he essentially is embracing the assertions that have been made and expanding on them. And I was in Michigan in 2016, and you could feel the antipathy toward Hillary Clinton. And as we know, this whole narrative doesn't mention anything about the domestic actors who prevented people from voting through the sophisticated and complex voter suppression schemes run by the Republicans. He doesn't mention the 75,000 voters in Detroit whose ballots didn't indicate any preference for president, but they voted down ticket, which is highly suspicious in a state that was given to Trump by a margin of less than 11,000 votes. And so I'm going to stop punishing you here with any more clips from Clint Watts. I encourage you to watch this. I've linked to the video file in the podcast show file for today. And I invite you to watch this and listen and yell back at your TV or at your screen, just like I've been talking back here today, because we are seeing so much information that is pushed out to viewers who do not challenge the narrative, who do not have either the inclination or the imagination to figure out that some of the things they're being told are flatly untrue, others are unproven and exaggerated. And this is what passes for journalism at the independent NewsHour. They're not relying on commercial advertisers. They do more and more of this corporate underwriting, which is problematic. But they're not chasing ratings. And they do what they consider to be a diligent effort to give enough time to explain complex stories. But they routinely fail because they refuse to bring critics on. If Ray McGovern, if John Kiriakou, now he doesn't challenge the Russia narrative, but he does have a lot to say about other issues like Gina Haspel, these people are never invited to be guests on MSNBC or on the NewsHour. And so important perspectives are completely eliminated from the get-go, and you get this kind of insider conversation where the consensus views and the insider knowledge is all treated as just facts that we all know and shouldn't challenge. There's another video that I've linked to in the show file for today's podcast, and it is a dissection, a breakdown of the events in the police killing of Stephon Clark in Sacramento earlier this year. Likewise, I encourage you to follow the links. The New York Times did an excellent job. It's an 8-minute video where they painstakingly take you through, second by second, the events as they unfurled very quickly in Sacramento on that Saturday night. And the takeaway for me after watching this video carefully is that, yes, the police officers were called to a scene. Stephon Clark was behaving in a bizarre and unpredictable way. He was seen by a helicopter jumping the fence from his house to his grandmother's house. He was not trespassing, but it probably looked like it to the authorities. And when the cops believed that he had a gun, they didn't bother to really wait and see. They started firing. Stephon Clark hit the ground, and then they fired another 5 to 7 bullets into his motionless body. Then they waited a full 5 minutes before even attempting to give first aid, assuming that if they approached him, he might suddenly pop up with a gun and shoot them. And this kind of paranoia on the part of professional police officers is completely unacceptable. And my bottom line is that they need to be trained to use the minimum level of force necessary. This video shows that they first shot Stephon Clark in his left leg, and that's what caused him to hit the ground. And even if he had been armed, they did not have to fire that second barrage of bullets. And I hope that this is something that we can all learn from, although the way people close ranks around law enforcement, even when they murder people, is a real problem in this country today. And there's one more video I've linked to while we're linking to videos today, and this came from Vice News. I saw it a couple of days ago, and it presents the voices of 18 teachers from Oklahoma. Teachers who have given up because they are not getting raises, they don't have the resources they need, and they don't see any hope on the horizon. And I hope you'll take a look at this because I think it really depicts in their own voices the dedication of teachers, the frustration that they endure, and that some of them give up and move on to other professions. There's an interesting trend in both new media and old media, and it embraces collective bargaining. Yes, good old-fashioned unions. The latest scene of unionization is Condé Nast's trademark publication or flagship publication, The New Yorker. The editorial staff members yesterday voted to form a union. 90% of the workforce signed on to join the News Guild of New York, and that guild already represents the New York Times, the Associated Press, Reuters, the New Republic, the Daily Beast, about 115 people in the New Yorker unit. And in terms of new media, HuffPost, Vox Media, Vice Media, Slate, and Mike, along with Fast Company, the business publication, are all in the process of unionizing now. And the Chicago Tribune, owned by Tronc, and the LA Times, which is being sold by Tronc to another company, those are both the sites of fresh unionization efforts right now. I'm glad to see it. On to the international trade wars. The Trump administration has agreed to relax its penalties of the Chinese telecom company ZTE. The agreement is that ZTE will pay a $1 billion fine and fund a new in-house compliance team staffed by American experts. And this eases a 7-year ban that was announced in April, blocking ZTE from buying American parts, and the Chinese said that would force that company out of business. So it's interesting to see the partisan response from House Minority Leader Nancy Pelosi. She took the cheesy way out. She said, China is eating our lunch and this president is serving it up to them. Now, instead, she should be criticizing this back-scratching deal where Trump went easy on ZTE, Ivanka got her licenses for new products and services to sell in China, and a Trump deal in Indonesia valued at $500 million got an infusion of cash from the Chinese government. Now, this occurs at the very same time that there are skirmishes over the military intentions of the Chinese, the former Spratly Islands that they've built a military base at. And also, there is a new wave of reports that American diplomats in China are the targets of what are described as sonic attacks. Now, we heard about this in Cuba last year, and after many investigations, no evidence was produced to show that there's some secret sonic weapon that causes hearing loss and some other symptoms that have been reported, like headaches, sleeplessness, and nausea. So this is something that will have to be further investigated. But as I mentioned, in January of this year, an FBI report said that after a 4-month investigation, agents found no evidence that sound waves could have damaged the Americans' health in Cuba. Meanwhile, North Korea, in its latest step to set the table for the Singapore summit next week, have announced that they are destroying facilities used for testing the long-range missiles that shook Trump up and kind of surprised our CIA and other intelligence experts over the past year or so. So the Kusong test site was blown up in North Korea. This is where they launched a solid-fuel mid-range ballistic missile. And this is apparently another step after the demolition we saw on video, but it hasn't been fully determined whether all of the nuclear testing facilities actually were demolished in the episode just a couple of weeks ago. But these are indications, even if these are concocted videos, that North Korea does have an agenda, and they are trying to at least put on the table the potential for a deal for a peace treaty to end the 1950s Korean War and for what is described as denuclearization. Now, our president is equally arrogant and ignorant, and he comes off as a buffoon so many times it is deeply embarrassing. The latest is he told reporters today that he doesn't think he has to do much preparation for the meeting with Kim Jong-un. "I think I'm very well prepared," Trump said. "I don't think I have to prepare very much. It's about the attitude. It's about the willingness to get things done." Well, I think he misunderestimates, to borrow a malaprop from George W. Bush, the potential of Kim Jong-un to run the table. Now, this report from the Washington Post reads, Trump is seeking to get North Korea to agree to denuclearize, but acknowledge that this is not likely to happen immediately. So he is lowering expectations of his Twitter fans. And it's going to be fascinating to see how it all goes. I've been in touch with the globe-trotting international reporter Pepe Escobar. He will be in Singapore, and he has agreed to talk with us a week from tomorrow, Friday on June 15th, and we will bring you that podcast interview if it comes off as scheduled. The other exhibition of arrogance and ignorance by Trump most recently is a phone call on May 25th with Prime Minister Justin Trudeau of Canada. Trudeau is upset at the tariffs on steel and aluminum. Canada has announced retaliatory tariffs. And in that conversation, Trump said to Trudeau, "Didn't you guys," meaning Canada, "burn down the White House?" Now, the context here is a little bit fuzzy. Even fuzzier than the grasp of history that Trump demonstrates. Because it was the British who burned the White House down during the War of 1812. And just for your historical reference, Canada didn't become a nation until 1867. Every day I pause for a minute to thank the people who support my work here at the Peter B. Collins Podcast with your subscriptions. Generous people like Clifford Johnson. He's a new subscriber. Thank you, Clifford. Carl Howard, longtime supporter from Columbus, Ohio. Susan Gavet from right here in my backyard in Marin County, California, as well as Jim Garrison. I appreciate your kicking in a few bucks every month to keep this podcast going, and I want to see if more people will do the same. Just come to peterbcollins.com, find the menu tab, pull it down, click on Become a Subscriber. You'll land on the sign-up page, and you can make an easy choice of $5, $10, $20, $50 as our annual subscription, and I appreciate any level of support you can provide. And if you don't like PayPal, you can communicate with me in the good old U.S. mail. My address is Box 150, 660, San Rafael, California, 94915. That's Box 150, 660, San Rafael, 94915. Well, two stories today surfaced. The first headline from the New York Times earlier in the day, Paul Ryan promises House immigration vote in election season. And a few hours later, The Guardian posted a story, House Republicans fail to reach deal on immigration reform. At issue here is a group of so-called moderate Republicans who don't want to punish the Dreamers. And they want to get separate legislation to put a new version of DACA or a DREAM Act into effect. And they see their chances for re-election this fall linked to a resolution of this hostage crisis that was artificially created by Trump last year. And Paul Ryan is in a pickle because his hardline, knuckle-dragging, anti-immigrant right-wingers say, hey, this is a great issue for us. Do nothing on the Dreamers because that will pander to the haters and the racist people who are a key element of the Republican base. But the moderates say, well, we might not retain our majority. We might lose in November if we don't deal with this issue. The tragedy in Gaza continues. Last week, we saw the sniper fire killing Razan al-Najjar. I'm sorry, it's Najjar. She was the 21-year-old medic who was out there at the fence. She was trying to pull an injured protester back who apparently had crossed over into Israeli territory when she was shot and killed by an IDF sniper. Now, Israel, always ready to defend the indefensible, has released information that we can't verify, but I'll share it with you anyway. You deserve to know. The IDF Twitter account released a short cut of an interview that Razan gave before her death. She describes herself as being a human shield and rescuer for the injured on the front lines. But the IDF edited that to say, I am here on the front lines to act as a human shield. So they're trying to make her a Hamas militant when I don't have any evidence to establish that. 3 days after she was killed, her cousin discovered that another cousin, Ramzi, had been killed in Gaza as well. He was a 30-year-old, and the report is that he was running toward the border fence when he was shot by the IDF on June 4th, 3 days after Razan had been shot nearby. And that's not all the tragedy in one family. Najjar's baby cousin, born this month with respiratory distress, died in Gaza this week because the blockade prevents critical medical supplies from reaching those who are ill and suffering in Gaza. A new investigation released by the Senate Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations accuses Barack Obama and the administration he ran of lying about efforts to help Iran after they signed the nuclear deal convert some of the frozen funds into currency that they could actually use. It's a little complicated. The idea was that we had to issue licenses for them to use an Omani bank that's in the country of Oman, and they wanted to convert the money from Omani rials into euros after first exchanging them into U.S. dollars. Now, I don't understand all the complexities of this, but the bottom line is the Obama administration issued a license and then said that they hadn't done it. So there does appear to be deception accused here. I'm sure Trump will pick up on this in future tweets, and that's why I share it with you today. There's also a leak by ABC News of an advance look at the report from the Inspector General of the Justice Department investigating the actions of former AG Loretta Lynch and former FBI Director James Comey related to the Clinton email investigation. Comey's announcement in July that the investigation was over and that Hillary would not be charged. Then, of course, after the Wiener laptop was turned over, he came back in October, said the investigation had been reopened. Days later, he said it had been closed again, and this, of course, did rile a lot of people, and I don't dispute that it had an impact on the outcome of the election. And we know that the pretext for firing Comey was his handling of these issues. Well, we only have part of the Inspector General report, but it indicates that they will slap the wrists of Lynch and of Comey, particularly in Comey's case, that he had abused his authority and essentially was speaking out of turn when he, as the FBI director, made these announcements. The argument is they should have been made by the Justice Department, and I think this will also become an issue in future tweets from our dear tweeter. On this next story, I jotted down the comment, "Let them eat snake." It was Marie Antoinette who said of the poor in France, "Let them eat cake." Well, Ben Carson, the doctor who has no experience with public housing, who Trump selected to run the wrecking crew at Housing and Urban Development, HUD, Carson has announced that the best thing to do for the poverty-stricken people who live in these housing projects is to raise the rent. He thinks it will produce more workers who live in subsidized housing. But many of the working poor who have seen limited, if any, raises in the last few years cannot sustain an increase in their subsidized housing costs. And this is a clear path to homelessness for potentially millions of people. Initially, the rent increases of 20 to 25%, in some cases much more, will go into effect this year. Others, that'll be about 2 million people. Others will see the rent increases phased in over about 6 years. But the idea that soaking the poor for more rent money is going to cause them to go out and find a better job or to find a job to begin with, I understand the employment cycle is swinging and there are more job opportunities. But if you don't have an education, if you have a criminal record, there are many impediments to the people who live in HUD housing to getting a job or to getting a job that can pay them enough money to pay the new rent levels. It's really cruel and insidious. Very Trumpian. And finally today, Scott Pruitt was at this meeting that Trump called yesterday to trot out Melania to prove that she's still alive and doesn't have any black eyes. Scott Pruitt is the embattled director of the EPA, dodging all kinds of investigations. And the latest little flap is the White House mess, that's the cafeteria, which offers bargain-priced lunches for people who are invited to eat there, has politely asked Scott Pruitt to find another place to eat lunch. Apparently he goes there almost every day, and they've asked him to cut it out. Now, in addition, we know about the sweetheart deal he got on the condo in the Capitol for $50 a night. He gave raises to his cronies from Oklahoma and denied it. He was flying first class. He spent money on security details that were unnecessary. There's the soundproof booth. And there's much more. I mean, this guy is a walking set of conflicts of interest and criminal intent. Maybe you've heard about his efforts to get the Chick-fil-A company to assign a coveted franchise to his wife, using government employees and his status as the director of the EPA. But Trump doesn't see a problem. At that meeting yesterday to prove that Melania is still alive, he said, "Thank you, Scott, very much. EPA is doing really, really well." And you know, somebody has to say that about you a little bit. That's Trump's way, like a mob boss, of praising him in a way that lets him know that he could be fired at any time. And so he better continue to carry Trump's water. Thanks for listening to my daily news and comment podcast. You can share it with absolutely anyone, and you'll find it on YouTube. I'm Peter B.
Happy trails to you until we meet again. Happy trails to you. Keep smiling.